There were 2 patrol cars parked outside my cabin before the sun had even cleared the tree line. Snow was still falling in slow, fat flakes, the kind that make everything look softer than it actually is. I stood in my doorway in a flannel jacket, watching the breath of 2 officers turn to fog in the cold air, and thinking that none of this made any sense. 12 hours earlier, the only problem in my life was a broken porch light. Now there was a woman in a puffer coat behind the officers, arms crossed, pointing at my yard like she'd just uncovered a crime scene. She wasn't law enforcement. She wasn't a surveyor. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, and she had called the police on me over something buried under 6 inches of fresh snow. I should mention, I'm not a difficult person, and I don't argue for the sake of arguing. I've spent my career in federal law enforcement, so I understand rules and boundaries better than most. I know what authority looks like when it's used correctly, and what it looks like when someone uses a position of power to settle a personal score. What the HOA president didn't know, standing there with her phone already out recording, was that the thing she was so convinced I was hiding under that snow wasn't a violation at all. It wasn't even close. By the time the officers finished walking my property that morning, the only person about to have an uncomfortable conversation wasn't me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The moment those officers stepped onto my driveway, I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that local law enforcement was standing on my property at 7 in the morning, called there by a woman who had never once, in 2 years, given me the benefit of the doubt about anything. She'd accused me of code violations before. She'd accused me of ignoring HOA notices I never received. But this time was different. This time, she was telling 2 uniformed officers that I had something hidden on my property that I shouldn't have, something she described as deliberate and concerning. The officers, to their credit, didn't seem convinced of anything yet. They were polite, professional, the kind of calm that comes from doing this job long enough to know that most disputes between neighbors are rarely what they're made out to be on the phone. One of them looked at me, then back at the HOA president, then at the unbroken blanket of snow covering my yard, and asked a simple question. "Ma'am, what exactly are we looking for?" She didn't answer right away. And in that pause, standing there in the cold, I realized this wasn't going to be the quick, embarrassing inconvenience she probably expected when she picked up the phone that morning. This was going to be the day she finally ran out of road. To understand how we got to that driveway, you have to go back to the day I first moved into that cabin and the very first time she decided I was a problem. My name is Daniel, and I've worked as a deputy U.S. Marshal for almost 14 years. It's not the kind of job that makes for easy small talk at neighborhood barbecues, but it taught me something most people never have to learn firsthand. How to read a situation calmly, gather facts before reacting, and never let someone else's anger become my problem to solve emotionally. That mindset turned out to matter more than I expected once I moved into Birchwood Hollow. Birchwood Hollow is a small mountain community about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place people move to for quiet winters, tall pines, and a little distance from everything. The homes are spread out, mostly cabins and chalet-style houses, each sitting on a generous lot with its own driveway carved into the slope of the hill. I bought my cabin 2 years ago. It backs up to a stretch of wooded land, has a long gravel driveway curving down from the road, and came with a detached storage shed near the back property line, something the previous owners used for firewood and tools. Before I ever signed the paperwork, I did what 14 years in federal law enforcement trained me to do. I read everything. I went through the property survey line by line. I reviewed the recorded deed. I read the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions from cover to cover, twice, because I wanted to know exactly what I was agreeing to before I agreed to it. The shed, the driveway, the section of yard that ran along the tree line. All of it was clearly within my property boundary, confirmed by a licensed survey that the title company had on file. I kept a copy. I always keep a copy. That detail matters, because it's the foundation of everything that happened later. The HOA president, a woman named Carol Whitfield, had been running the board for almost 6 years by the time I moved in. From what I gathered from other residents, Carol treated the HOA less like a community organization and more like her own territory. She wasn't elected so much as she was the only person willing to do the paperwork, and over time, nobody had bothered to challenge her for the position. People told me, almost as a warning, that Carol had a habit of treating any property she didn't fully understand as a violation waiting to be discovered. My first interaction with Carol came about 3 weeks after I moved in. She knocked on my door, introduced herself, and within the first 2 minutes of conversation, informed me that my mailbox post was the wrong shade of brown, according to community guidelines. I hadn't even unpacked all my boxes yet. I told her I'd look into it, mostly to be polite, and when I actually checked the HOA guidelines that night, there was no mention of approved mailbox post colors anywhere in the document. I let it go. It seemed like a small thing, the kind of misunderstanding that happens when someone is overly enthusiastic about their role. But it didn't stop there. Over the following months, Carol found other things to flag. The angle of my trash bins on collection day. The height of grass near my shed, even though it was within the limits stated in the CC and RS. A holiday wreath she claimed was too secular for the community's seasonal guidelines, which, again, didn't exist in writing. Each time, I responded the same way, politely, factually, and without raising my voice. I'd point to the actual governing documents, show her the specific language, and the conversation would usually end with her walking away unsatisfied but unable to argue the point. I want to be fair here. Not every HOA board member is like Carol. Plenty of communities have HOAs that function exactly as intended, maintaining shared spaces, enforcing reasonable standards, and operating with transparency. Birchwood Hollow's board, on paper, was supposed to work the same way. But somewhere along the way, Carol had stopped treating the CC and RS as a shared rulebook and started treating her own interpretation of community standards as law, regardless of what was actually written down. What made this particular winter different wasn't anything I did. It was something Carol noticed from her car one afternoon, driving past my property on her way back from a board meeting. She saw the snow building up near my shed, saw a shape underneath it she didn't recognize, and decided, without asking me a single question first, that she'd finally caught me doing something seriously wrong. She didn't knock on my door that day. She didn't leave a note, send an email, or call the number she had on file from the HOA directory. Instead, she went straight to the non-emergency police line, told them she had reason to believe a resident was concealing something dangerous on his property, and waited for a response. That's how, less than 18 hours later, 2 patrol cars ended up parked outside my cabin in the snow. The morning it actually happened started like any other. I'd made coffee, let the dog out, and was checking the weather report on my phone when I heard tires crunching on the gravel out front. I figured it was a delivery, maybe a neighbor. What I saw through the window was Carol's SUV parked at an angle across the bottom of my driveway, and Carol herself already out of the vehicle, walking toward my shed with her phone held up in front of her like she was filming a documentary. I opened the door before she reached the porch. "Carol, can I help you with something?" She didn't turn around right away. She kept her phone pointed at the snow-covered mound near my shed, narrating quietly to herself, or maybe to whoever she imagined might be watching the video later. When she finally looked at me, her expression was the kind people get when they think they've caught someone in the act. "I know what's under there, Daniel," she said. "I saw it yesterday when I drove by. You can drop the act." I genuinely had no idea what she was talking about. Underwear? The snow? Don't play dumb with me. That's a vehicle. Or equipment. Something you're hiding from inspection. She gestured at the mound, which, to be fair, did have an unusual shape under the fresh snowfall. The CC and RS are very clear about unauthorized structures and undisclosed modifications to the property. I want to pause here and explain something, because this is where the pattern really started to show itself. Carol had a habit of citing the CC and RS as though they were a living, flexible document that conformed to whatever she needed them to say in the moment. In reality, the CC and RS for Birchwood Hollow were about 40 pages long, and I'd read every page. There was no clause about unauthorized structures that applied to something sitting on a homeowner's private property, behind their own shed, especially when that something had been there, unchanged, since before I'd even bought the place. "Carol, I think you're talking about the old generator housing," I said, keeping my voice level. "It's been there since the previous owners. It's a metal frame that used to hold a backup generator. There's no generator in it anymore. It's just the frame and a tarp. I can show you, if that would help." "I don't need you to show me anything. I need you to understand that concealing equipment or structures from HOA review is a violation, and at this point, given your pattern of noncompliance, I'm not inclined to take your word for it." That phrase, pattern of noncompliance, stuck with me, mostly because it was the first time Carol had explicitly suggested that my history of pushing back against her ungrounded accusations was itself evidence of guilt. In her mind, every time I'd corrected her about the mailbox post, the trash bins, or the wreath, I hadn't been pointing out that she was wrong. I'd been building a track record. It was a strange kind of logic, where being right too many times eventually gets reframed as being difficult, and being difficult gets reframed as guilt. Carol, I'm happy to clear up any confusion, I said. But I'd like to understand specifically which section of the CC and RS you believe applies here, because in 2 years of living here, I haven't seen anything that requires pre-approval for existing structures. It's implied, she said. The HOA has broad authority to interpret undefined situations in the best interest of the community. That's not actually how implied authority works in a governing document, but I didn't say that yet. I've learned, both professionally and personally, that correcting someone's legal reasoning in the heat of the moment rarely changes their mind. It usually just escalates things. So instead, I asked her plainly what she wanted me to do. I want you to remove the tarp so I can document what's underneath, she said. Today, or I'll be reporting this as a willful violation to the full board, and you can explain yourself at the next hearing. I looked at her for a moment, trying to figure out whether she actually believed what she was saying or whether this was the version of events she'd already decided to tell other people, regardless of what I said next. Some confrontations are about getting to the truth. Others are about confirming a story someone has already written in their head. I was starting to suspect this was the second kind. Carol, can I ask what specifically you saw from your car that made you think this was a vehicle or unauthorized equipment? Because from where you would have been on the road, that shed and the frame behind it are at least 60 feet back, partially obscured by trees. She hesitated, just slightly, before answering. I know what I saw. The shape was unmistakable. Under 6 inches of fresh snow, from 60 feet away, through trees, I said, not as an accusation, just as a simple observation. I'm not trying to argue with you. I just want to understand the basis for this before we go any further. She didn't like that question. I could tell, because instead of answering it, she shifted the conversation back to procedure, the same way people do when they don't actually have an answer but don't want to admit it. The basis is that residents are required to disclose modifications and structures for HOA review. You didn't disclose this. It's not a modification. It's something that came with the house, documented on the survey I have on file from the title company. I'd be glad to show you that documentation, if it would help clear this up faster than standing out here in the cold. Here's where I'll be honest with you. Standing there, watching someone with no legal authority over my private property demand that I uncover something on my own land, I felt that familiar, quiet frustration a lot of homeowners know. Not anger, exactly. More like disbelief that I was being asked to justify something on my own property to someone with no documented basis for the request, who seemed less interested in resolving the confusion than in being proven right. I want to ask you something here, because I think a lot of you have been in a version of this moment. If someone with no real authority over your property showed up demanding access to something on your land, based on nothing but a guess from their car window, what would you do? Would you comply just to keep the peace? Or would you hold your ground and ask them to show you exactly where that authority comes from? I'd be curious to hear your answer in the comments, because what I did next is exactly what set the rest of this story in motion. I told Carol I wasn't going to remove anything based on a verbal accusation with no documentation behind it. I told her that if the HOA board had a formal concern, I'd be glad to respond to it in writing, the same way every other resident would be expected to. I kept my tone calm. I didn't raise my voice or tell her she was overstepping, even though, professionally, I recognized exactly what overstepping looked like. Carol's face tightened. She lowered her phone for the first time since she'd arrived. You're refusing to cooperate. I'm asking for the same due process anyone else would get, I said. That's not refusing. That's following the rules you keep telling me I'm breaking. She didn't respond to that directly. Instead, she turned, walked back toward her SUV, and said, loud enough for me to hear over the crunch of snow under her boots, "We'll see how cooperative you are once this becomes official." I watched her drive off, the taillights disappearing around the bend in the road, and for a moment, I genuinely thought that was the end of it. Another overreaction, another empty threat, The kind of thing that usually fizzled out within a day or two once Carol realized there was nothing actionable to pursue. I had no idea how wrong I was. 2 days passed without a word from Carol, which, in hindsight, wasn't relief, it was preparation. On the third morning, I found a notice taped to my front door, printed on official-looking HOA letterhead, citing me for unauthorized structure/failure to disclose, under a section number that, when I checked it against my own copy of the CC and RS that evening, didn't exist. The document referenced Section 7.4, subsection C. My copy of the CC and RS only went up to Section 7.3. I want to pause on that, because it tells you a lot about how this was being handled. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Someone had typed up a citation, formatted it to look official, and cited a rule that wasn't real. I photographed the notice immediately, the way I would document any piece of evidence, time-stamped and clear, and saved it alongside the actual CC and RS document for comparison. That evening, I got a phone call. Not from Carol directly, but from a number associated with the HOA's general line, with Carol's voice on the other end. "Daniel, this is Carol. I wanted to follow up on the notice. The board has scheduled a compliance hearing for next week, and I strongly recommend you take this seriously. We've also discussed implementing a fine schedule starting at $200 per day until the violation is resolved." Carol, I looked at the citation. Section 7.4 subsection C doesn't exist in the CC and RS. The document only goes up to Section 7.3. There was a pause on the line. "The board is in the process of updating the governing documents. That section reflects upcoming changes. Upcoming changes can't be retroactively applied to cite an existing resident for an existing structure," I said, keeping my voice even though what she'd just said wasn't how governing documents work in any HOA I'd ever heard of. Rules that don't exist, yet can't be the basis for a violation today. "I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to debate legal theory with you," Carol said, her tone sharpening. "What I will tell you is that if you don't remove the tarp and allow inspection within 72 hours, I'm prepared to escalate this to towing and lien proceedings against the property." That was new. Towing didn't make sense. There was no vehicle involved that I was aware of, and liens against a property require a documented, valid violation, not an invented section number. But I learned by then that pointing out logical inconsistencies in real time rarely slowed Carol down. If anything, it seemed to make her dig in further, as though backing down on a threat, even an unenforceable one, would somehow validate everything I'd said. "Carol, I want to be straightforward with you," I said. "I'm not trying to create conflict here. I'm telling you, calmly, that the citation references a section that doesn't exist, and I have documentation showing the structure in question predates my ownership and is within my property boundary according to the recorded survey. If the board wants to schedule a hearing, I'll attend, and I'll bring that documentation." "You can bring whatever you'd like," she said. "But I think you'll find the board takes a very different view of repeated noncompliance than you do." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there for a minute, going over the conversation, trying to figure out at what point this had stopped being about an actual concern. I don't think it's useful to assume what's going on inside someone else's head, but what I can tell you is what I observed. A citation built on a rule that didn't exist, a threat of escalating fines for a violation that hadn't been substantiated, and now talk of towing and liens over something that had nothing to do with the vehicle at all. The next development came 4 days later, in the form of an email sent to every resident in the HOA's mailing list, not just to me. The subject line read, "Community Safety Concern, Undisclosed Structures." The body didn't name me directly, but described, in specific enough detail, a property near the eastern tree line, where a resident was allegedly concealing equipment from inspection, raising concerns about community safety and property values. Anyone who knew the neighborhood layout would know exactly whose house she meant. That email is when I started to take this seriously in a different way. Up until that point, I treated it as an annoying but contained dispute between me and Carol. The mass email changed that. Now my name, even unspoken, was attached to a public accusation sent to every household in Birchwood Hollow, implying I was a safety risk, based entirely on a guess Carol had made from her car window, dressed up with an invented rule and an unenforceable threat. I want to ask you something here, because I think this is the moment a lot of these situations turn from frustrating into something more serious. When someone uses their position, whether it's an HOA board seat or some other small slice of authority, not to solve an actual problem, but to pressure someone into compliance, does that still read as a misunderstanding to you? Or does it start to look like a power trip, where the goal isn't resolution, it's control? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. I didn't respond to the mass email. I didn't post a rebuttal or call other residents to defend myself, even though a few neighbors reached out privately, asking if everything was all right, clearly having pieced together who the email was about. Instead, I did what 14 years in federal law enforcement had trained me to do when someone escalates without basis. I started building a file. I went back through every notice Carol had ever sent me, going back to the mailbox post-complaint, and laid them out chronologically. I pulled the recorded property survey from the title company again, this time requesting a certified copy. I pulled the full, current CC and RS directly from the HOA's management portal and compared it line by line against the citation taped to my door. The mismatch was easy to document. Section 7.3 ended with language about exterior paint colors. There was no Section 7.4 anywhere in the recorded document, subsection, or otherwise. I also requested, through that same portal, the minutes from the most recent board meeting, the one where Carol claimed the board had discussed a fine schedule and towing escalation. The minutes were sparse, but specific about what had actually been voted on, and a fine schedule wasn't listed anywhere in them. There was a note about ongoing review of a resident concern, and signed, unattributed to any formal motion or vote. That told me something important. Whatever Carol was threatening me with over the phone hadn't actually been authorized by the board. It was, as far as the official record showed, her own initiative, presented as though it carried institutional weight it didn't have. I kept all of this organized the way I would any case file, dated, sourced, cross-referenced. Not because I expected to need it in front of a judge, but because the difference between a dispute that resolves calmly and one that spirals into something worse almost always comes down to whether someone has accurate documentation to bring to the conversation. People who are bluffing tend to fold when the actual record gets put on the table. I was about to find out which kind of person Carol was. In the meantime, the 72-hour deadline Carol had given me over the phone came and went. I didn't remove the tarp. I didn't allow an unauthorized inspection of my own property, based on an invented rule. What I did instead was send a single, calm, written response to the HOA's official email address, copying the property management company listed in the CC and RS as the board's administrative contact. I stated plainly that the cited section did not exist in the recorded governing documents, that the structure in question predated my ownership and was documented on the certified survey, and that I would welcome a formal review through the board's actual, documented process, rather than informal threats over the phone. I didn't hear back right away. For a few days, things went quiet again, the kind of quiet that, by now, I'd learned not to mistake for resolution. For almost a week, nothing happened. No notices on the door, no mass emails to the neighborhood, no phone calls from Carol or anyone associated with the HOA. I went back to my normal routine. I shoveled the driveway after a fresh snowfall, took the dog out twice a day, worked my usual shifts, and honestly, started to let myself believe that my written response, the one laying out the discrepancy in the cited section and the documentation supporting the structure's legitimacy, had done what calm, factual pushback usually does. I figured the property management company had read it, recognized the citation was flawed, and quietly told Carol to drop it before it became a liability for the HOA itself. A couple of neighbors mentioned, in passing, that Carol had seemed unusually quiet at the most recent casual gathering at the community clubhouse, which for her was out of character. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who'd lived in Birchwood Hollow longer than almost anyone, told me with a slight smile that he'd seen this movie before, and that Carol tended to go quiet right before she decided to come back swinging in a different direction entirely. He'd been on the receiving end of one of her campaigns himself, years earlier, over something to do with a fence line that turned out to be perfectly within code. I appreciated the warning, but at the time, I didn't fully grasp what he meant by it. I want to be honest about how that week felt, because I think it's a familiar feeling for anyone who's dealt with a prolonged dispute like this one. There's a specific kind of relief that comes from silence after weeks of tension, the sense that maybe, finally, things have settled. I let myself enjoy a few quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, watching snow collect on the pines without thinking about citations or invented sections of a rulebook that didn't apply to me. I even mentioned to a coworker during a shift that the HOA situation seemed to be resolving itself, that sometimes the best response really is just calm, documented pushback and patience, rather than escalating things further myself. But there was one detail I noticed, almost in passing, that I didn't think much of at the time. Driving back from a late shift one evening, I passed Carol's house and saw her car in the driveway alongside an unfamiliar sedan, the kind with a small magnetic logo on the door that I couldn't quite make out in the dark. I didn't think anything of it. People have visitors. HOA presidents have meetings. It wasn't until much later that I understood what, or who, that visit had actually been about, and how much it would shape the version of events Carol would eventually tell anyone willing to listen. For now, though, the quiet held. The snow kept falling, gentle and steady, the kind that blankets a property and makes everything look settled, peaceful, finished. I remember standing at my window one night, looking out at my own yard under that fresh layer of white, thinking that whatever this had been, it seemed to be over. I didn't know yet that Carol hadn't backed off at all. She'd simply changed her approach, and the next time she showed up, she wasn't going to be standing on my porch alone with her phone out. She was going to bring backup, and she was going to make sure it looked, to anyone watching, like she'd been right about me from the very beginning. The morning the patrol cars showed up, the one I described at the very beginning of this story, started exactly the way I told you. 2 officers, calm and professional, standing in the snow while Carol pointed at the mound near my shed and insisted I was hiding something dangerous from the community. What I didn't tell you yet was what led up to that moment, and how Carol had spent the quiet week beforehand preparing for it. The unfamiliar sedan I'd seen in her driveway belonged to a cousin of hers, someone who, according to what I later pieced together from neighbors, worked in a loosely related field and had encouraged Carol to frame her complaint in terms that would guarantee a fast response, specifically suggesting language like concealed equipment and potential safety hazard. I don't say that to suggest Carol did anything illegal by calling the police. She had every right to call. What I'm describing is a pattern I'd seen before, where someone learns which words tend to escalate a response, and uses them not because the urgency matches, but because they want the weight that comes with police involvement, hoping it pressures the other side into compliance faster than a written notice ever could. So that morning, when I opened my door to find 2 officers and Carol standing in my driveway, I understood immediately what was happening, even before anyone said a word. The lead officer introduced himself as Officer Reyes, his partner as Officer Hale. Both were calm, neither rushed, and neither treated me as anything other than a homeowner responding to a knock at his own door. Reyes explained that they'd received a call about a possible undisclosed structure or concealed item on the property, described as a potential safety concern, and that they were following up to clarify the situation. He had a small notepad out, and he made it clear from the start that this was a fact-finding visit, not anything resembling an accusation against me personally. "I appreciate you both coming out," I said. "I'm happy to walk you through everything. Can I ask what specifically was reported?" Reyes glanced at Carol, who answered before he could. "I told them there's a structure under that snow that's never been disclosed or inspected. It could be anything. A vehicle, equipment, who knows what he's hiding back there." Officer Hale looked at the mound near the shed, then back at Carol. "Ma'am, do you have any specific reason to believe what's under there poses an actual safety risk, or is this related to a property dispute?" "It's both," Carol said. "It's a violation of HOA rules, and frankly, given his behavior, I don't think it's unreasonable to wonder what someone is hiding. I want to point out something here, because it's relevant to how this conversation went from that point forward." Officer Reyes asked Carol, directly, what specific rule had been violated. Carol referenced Section 7.4, subsection C again, the same invented citation from the notice taped to my door weeks earlier. I watched Reyes write something down, his expression neutral, professional, giving away nothing. "Sir, do you have any documentation on the property, or on this structure specifically?" Reyes asked me. "I do. I have the certified property survey, the recorded deed, and a complete copy of the HOA's CC and RS pulled directly from their resident portal. I'd be glad to bring all of it out, if that would help." "That would help a great deal," Reyes said. I went inside and retrieved the folder I'd been keeping, Organized exactly the way I would organize any documentation in a professional context, dated and labeled, every page in chronological order, exactly as I'd want it presented if I were the one reviewing it. When I came back out, Carol had her phone raised again, recording, narrating quietly under her breath about finally getting answers. I want to take a moment here and ask you something, because I think this is one of those details that really sticks with people. Have you ever seen authorities called out to a property over something this minor? An old metal frame under a tarp, something that had nothing to do with any actual danger or crime. It's a strange thing to witness, watching trained officers redirect their attention away from anything resembling an emergency and toward a documentation review for what amounts to a neighborhood disagreement. If you've experienced anything similar, where a call to the police ended up being about something this small, I'd be curious to know how that played out for you. Reyes took the folder and began reviewing it methodically, starting with the property survey. Hale, meanwhile, walked toward the mound near the shed, taking note of its size and shape, careful not to disturb the snow yet. "Ma'am," Hale said to Carol, "before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. Our role here is to assess whether there's an actual safety concern or criminal matter. Disputes about HOA rule violations, structure approvals, things like that, those typically fall under civil and community governance matters, not something we'd be enforcing directly." "But you're here," Carol said, an edge creeping into her voice. "Doesn't that mean there's a basis for the complaint?" "We respond to the report we receive," Reyes said evenly. "That doesn't mean every report turns out to involve something within our jurisdiction to resolve. Let's take a look at what's actually here before we draw any conclusions." I appreciated that response more than I think Carol expected anyone to. It was calm, accurate, and didn't presume guilt on either side. Exactly the kind of measured approach I'd want from any officer in a situation like this. Carol, for her part, seemed visibly frustrated that the conversation wasn't unfolding the way she'd clearly imagined it would when she made that call. Reyes finished reviewing the survey and looked up. "This shows the structure footprint, dated well before the current ownership transfer. And this," he said, tapping the CC and RS printout, "only goes up to section 7.3. There's no 7.4 in here." Carol's expression shifted, just slightly, the first real crack in her certainty since she'd arrived. "That's an older version," she said quickly. "The board updated the documents. Do you have a recorded, current version reflecting that update?" Reyes asked. "Something we could compare against what the homeowner is showing us." Carol didn't answer right away. She glanced down at her phone, as if hoping to find something there that might back her up, but came up empty. And in that pause, standing in the snow with both officers now looking at her instead of me, I realized this conversation was about to go somewhere very different than the one she'd planned for when she made that call early that morning. Officer Reyes closed the CC and RS printout and set it carefully on top of the folder. "Let's go ahead and take a look at the structure itself, then. That'll probably clear up most of this faster than going back and forth on document versions." I walked the three of them over to the mound near my shed. Up close, with the fresh snow brushed away from the edges, the metal frame was obvious for what it was, a rectangular housing, rusted slightly at the corners, clearly old, clearly stationary, with a section of weathered tarp secured over the top. I pulled back the tarp myself, in full view of both officers and Carol, so there would be no ambiguity about who had uncovered what. Underneath was exactly what I'd told Carol it would be from the very first conversation. An empty generator housing frame, no engine, no wiring, no fuel lines, nothing inside it at all except a few inches of old leaves and snowmelt that had collected over the seasons. Officer Hale crouched down, looked it over for a moment, and stood back up. "This matches a standard backup generator enclosure," Hale said. "Pretty common setup for a property like this, especially with winter power outages being what they are out here." "It's empty," Reyes added, mostly for the record, jotting something down in his notepad. "No generator installed currently." Carol stepped closer, peering into the frame as if she expected something different to materialize the longer she looked at it. "That doesn't mean it wasn't being used for something else. Storage, maybe, or—" "Ma'am," Reyes said, not unkindly, but firmly enough to redirect the conversation. "What we're looking at is consistent with exactly what the homeowner described before we ever got here. An empty utility structure that predates his ownership of the property. I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where the documentation I'd been keeping actually mattered. I pulled out the certified survey and pointed to the structure's footprint, clearly marked on the diagram, dated from a survey conducted 3 years before I purchased the property. This shows the frame was already here when the previous owners had this survey done. It's not something I installed, modified, or concealed. It's been sitting exactly like this the entire time I've lived here. Reyes compared the survey diagram to the actual structure in front of him, nodding slowly. That lines up. Same dimensions, same placement relative to the shed. He took a photo of the diagram with his own department-issued camera, the kind of small, deliberate action that told me this was being handled the right way, methodically, without skipping a step just because the situation seemed minor. Then I pulled out the deed and the title company's disclosure documents, which listed the generator housing as an existing fixture at the time of sale, something both I and the previous owners had on record. Everything here is documented and was disclosed at the time of purchase. None of it was hidden, and none of it was new. Hale flipped through the disclosure pages briefly, then handed them back. This is pretty standard. Fixtures like this usually get listed exactly like this on a transfer of sale, especially anything related to utilities or backup power. Carol's posture had changed by this point. She was still holding her phone, but she'd stopped narrating into it altogether. Her arms were crossed tighter now, less out of confidence and more, it seemed to me, out of the realization that the conversation was no longer unfolding the way she'd expected it to when she'd dialed the non-emergency line the day before. "Carol," Reyes said, his tone still even, still professional. "Based on what's been presented here, both officers are documenting that this matter doesn't involve a criminal element or an immediate safety concern. The structure is consistent with the homeowner's account and the supporting documentation. Any remaining dispute about HOA compliance would need to go through the appropriate civil process, the board's own hearing procedure, or a property attorney if it escalates that far. That's not something we can resolve here on scene. But the citation," Carol started, "the violation notice I issued, referenced a section of your governing documents that doesn't appear to exist in the current recorded version," Reyes said, glancing again at the printout. "I'd recommend confirming that with whoever manages your HOA's official records before pursuing this further." I watched Carol's face as that sentence landed. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't yell, didn't storm off, didn't have some movie-style breakdown in the snow. What I saw instead was something quieter, and in a way, more telling. The realization that two professional, neutral officers had just reviewed everything she'd built her case on, in real time, in front of her, and found it didn't hold up. "I was acting on a genuine concern," she said, her voice lower now, less certain than it had been an hour earlier. "I understand that," Reyes said, "and reporting a concern isn't itself a problem. But going forward, it might help to verify the specifics before escalating to a citation or a call like this one." That was the moment the entire dynamic of the morning shifted. Up until then, every interaction with Carol had followed the same pattern, her asserting something with total confidence, and me having to calmly document my way back to the actual facts. Standing in the snow that morning, watching two officers walk through the same documentation I'd been trying to show her for weeks, I realized the only thing missing from our previous conversations had been someone neutral enough, with enough standing, for Carol to actually listen to. It wasn't that the facts had changed. It was that, for the first time, someone other than me was the one presenting them. Before the officers left, Reyes asked me a straightforward question. "Do you want this documented as a report, or are you comfortable with this being handled informally, since there's no actual violation here?" I thought about that for a moment. Part of me wanted to just let it go, chalk it up to an overzealous HOA president, and move on with my winter. But I'd been documenting this for weeks for a reason, and a pattern of fabricated citations and escalating, baseless threats wasn't something I wanted sitting unrecorded, in case it happened again, to me or to someone else in the neighborhood with less patience or fewer resources to push back. "I'd like it documented," I said, "not to cause problems for anyone, just so there's an official record showing what was reported and what was actually found." Reyes nodded and made a note. "That's reasonable. We'll file this as a property dispute inquiry, no violation found, structure consistent with documentation provided by homeowner." He read the summary back to me once he'd written it, making sure I agreed with how it was characterized before he closed his notepad. Carol didn't say much during this part. She'd gone quiet in a way that felt different from her earlier silences, less calculated, more like someone recalibrating in real time. She glanced once more at the empty generator frame, as if double-checking there wasn't something she'd missed, then looked away. Before the officers left, Hale turned to her and said, gently but plainly, "Ma'am, going forward, I'd recommend running things like this through your property management company or an attorney before involving law enforcement. Calls like this one are best reserved for actual safety concerns. Disputes over rule interpretation really do need to go through the board's formal process." "I understand," Carol said quietly. It was the first time in our entire dispute that I'd heard her sound unsure of herself, and it was a strange thing to witness after weeks of being on the receiving end of nothing but certainty. "I want to ask you something here, because I think it's worth sitting with for a second. Do you think Carol expected this outcome when she picked up the phone that morning?" My honest guess is no. I think she expected the officers to show up, see something out of the ordinary under the snow, demand I explain myself on the spot, and either find something she could escalate further, or at the very least, intimidate me into complying with a demand she had no actual authority to make. I don't think she expected to be the one standing there, in front of two officers, explaining why her own citation referenced a rule that didn't exist. The aftermath, in terms of actual consequences, unfolded over the following weeks rather than all at once. I followed up with the HOA's management company directly, providing the same documentation I'd shown the officers, the certified survey, the deed disclosures, and a side-by-side comparison of the cited section number against the actual recorded CC and RS. The management company, to their credit, took the discrepancy seriously. A few weeks later, I received a formal letter acknowledging that the citation had referenced an invalid section, that no violation existed regarding the generator housing, and that the matter was closed. What happened with Carol specifically, I learned mostly secondhand, the way most neighborhood news travels. Apparently, the board held an internal review after my documentation was submitted, examining not just my case, but a handful of other citations Carol had issued over the previous year that other residents had quietly disputed but never escalated. I don't know all the details, and I'm not going to speculate about things I didn't witness directly. What I do know, because it was eventually reflected in the HOA's own published meeting minutes, was that the board voted to require all future citations to be reviewed and co-signed by a second board member before being issued, and that Carol's role going forward would involve significantly less unilateral authority than it had before. That wasn't a punishment in the dramatic sense. Nobody was removed from their home or publicly humiliated, and frankly, I never wanted it to go that way. It was a structural change, the kind of correction that happens when an organization realizes one person has accumulated far more independent authority than was ever intended, and brings that back in line with how things were supposed to work. For a community that had let one resident hold that much unchecked influence for the better part of 6 years, it was a modest correction, but it was a real one, and from what I gathered, it was overdue. Winter passed the way it usually does in Birchwood Hollow, slow and quiet, with snow piling against the tree line and the occasional power flicker that made me genuinely grateful that old generator frame was sitting there, even empty, as a reminder of what backup power I'd eventually want to install once the season eased up. The shed never changed. The tarp went back over the frame, the same way it had been before any of this started. Carol and I never became friendly, exactly, but our interactions changed in a noticeable way. The mailbox complaints stopped. The vague accusations about trash bin angles and grass height stopped. When we did cross paths, at the mailbox or in the parking area near the clubhouse, the exchanges were short, polite, and entirely ordinary, the kind of interaction you'd expect between two neighbors who simply don't have much to say to each other, which honestly, after everything, felt like a fair outcome. I think about that morning sometimes, standing in the snow with two officers and a folder full of documentation, and what strikes me most isn't the dramatic image of patrol cars outside a cabin. It's how unremarkable the actual resolution was. No one raised their voice. No one was arrested or fined or publicly shamed. The whole thing came down to documentation, patience, and two professionals who took the time to actually look at the facts instead of accepting whatever version of events was presented to them first. I don't think Carol was a uniquely terrible person. I think she was someone who'd been given a small amount of authority over other people's property, never had it meaningfully challenged for years, and slowly came to believe that her interpretation of the rules carried more weight than the rules themselves. That's not a rare story in HOAs. It's a fairly common one, and I suspect a lot of people watching this have a version of Carol in their own neighborhood right now. Someone who simply never had to defend their assumptions in front of anyone with the standing to ask the right questions. What I'd want anyone in a similar situation to take from this isn't a lesson about winning or getting even. It's simpler than that. Document everything. Stay calm. Know the actual rules better than the person enforcing them. And when authority oversteps its bounds, the most effective response usually isn't anger. It's patience backed by facts. Looking back on that whole winter, I keep returning to one simple truth. The HOA, the citations, the threats of fines and towing and liens, none of it was ever really about a generator frame under a tarp. It was about whether someone with a small title and a strong opinion could pressure a homeowner into compliance without ever having to prove they were right. And in the end, the only thing that mattered, the only thing that ever really mattered, was the documentation. The deed. The survey. The actual rulebook, read cover to cover, instead of whatever version of it got recited out loud in the moment. If there's one takeaway I'd want you to walk away with, it's this. Authority, whether it comes from a badge, a board seat, or just someone's confident tone of voice, only carries weight when it's backed by something real. When it isn't, calm persistence and good documentation tend to be the most effective response there is, far more effective than arguing, and certainly more effective than backing down just to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with the story. If you enjoyed it, a like genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deal with situations like this in their own neighborhoods. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because there are plenty more stories like this one on the way, including one involving a property line dispute that escalated in a way I honestly didn't see coming until the very last conversation. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you directly. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a board member, or even just a neighbor who used a small amount of authority to make your life harder than it needed to be? What happened, and how did it get resolved, if it ever did? Drop your story in the comments. I read through them, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment from someone just like you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.